Chapter 9. Rediscovering Rest. One boiling summer weekend a few years ago, I joined the impassioned members of a campaigning group called Take Back Your Time in an airless university lecture theatre in Seattle, where they'd assembled to further their long-standing mission of eliminating the epidemic of overwork. The gathering in which I participated, their annual conference, was a sparsely attended affair, in part because, as the organisers conceded, it was August and lots of people were on vacation, and America's most stridently pro-relaxation organisation could hardly complain about that. But it was also because Take Back Your Time promotes what counts these days as a highly subversive message. There's nothing unusual about its demands for more days off or shorter working hours. Such proposals are increasingly common, but they're almost always justified on the grounds that a well-rested worker is a more productive worker, and it was precisely this rationale that the group had been set up to question. Why, its members wanted to know, should vacations by the ocean, or meals with friends, or lazy mornings in bed need defending in terms of improved performance at work? You keep hearing people arguing that more time off might be good for the economy, fumed John DeGraff, an ebullient 70-ish filmmaker and the driving force behind Take Back Your Time. But why should we have to justify life in terms of the economy? It makes no sense. Later, I learned about the existence of a rival initiative, Project Time Off, which, unlike Take Back Your Time, enjoyed generous corporate sponsorship and better attended conferences. And it was no surprise to learn that its mission was to promote the personal, business, social and economic benefits of leisure. It was also backed by the US Travel Association, which has its own reasons for wanting people to take more vacations. The decline of pleasure. DeGraff had put his finger on one of the sneakier problems with treating time solely as something to be used as well as possible, which is that we start to experience pressure to use our leisure time productively too. Enjoying leisure for its own sake, which you might have assumed was the whole point of leisure, comes to feel as though it's somehow not quite enough. It begins to feel as though you're failing at life in some indistinct way if you're not treating your time off as an investment in your future. Sometimes this pressure takes the form of the explicit argument that you ought to think of your leisure hours as an opportunity to become a better worker. "Relax, you'll be more productive," reads the headline on one hugely popular New York Times piece. But a more surreptitious form of the same attitude has also infected your friend who always seems to be training for a 10K, yet who's apparently incapable of just going for a run. She has convinced herself that running is a meaningful thing to do only insofar as it might lead toward a future accomplishment. And it infected me, too, during the years I spent attending meditation classes and retreats with the barely conscious goal that I might one day reach a condition of permanent calm. Even an undertaking as seemingly hedonistic as a year spent backpacking around the globe could fall victim to the same problem if your purpose isn't to explore the world, but, a subtle distinction, this, to add to your mental storehouse of experiences in the hope that you'll feel, later on, that you'd used your life well. The regrettable consequence of justifying leisure only in terms of its usefulness for other things is that it begins to feel vaguely like a chore. In other words, like work in the worst sense of that word. This was a pitfall the critic Walter Carr noticed back in 1962 in his book The Decline of Pleasure. "We are all of us compelled," Carr wrote, "to read for profit, party for contacts, gamble for charity, go out in the evening for the greater glory of the municipality, and stay home for the weekend to rebuild the house." Defenders of modern capitalism enjoy pointing out that despite how things might feel, we actually have more leisure time than we did in previous decades, an average of about 5 hours per day for men and only slightly less for women. But perhaps one reason we don't experience life that way is that leisure no longer feels very leisurely. Instead, it too often feels like another item on the to-do list. And like many of our time troubles, research suggests that this problem grows worse the wealthier you get. Rich people are frequently busy working, but they also have more options for how to use any given hour of free time. Like anyone else, they could read a novel or take a walk, but they could equally be attending the opera or planning a ski trip to Courchevel. So they're more prone to feeling that there are leisure activities they ought to be getting around to, but aren't. We probably can't hope to grasp how utterly alien this attitude toward leisure would have seemed to anyone living at any point before the Industrial Revolution. To the philosophers of the ancient world, leisure wasn't the means to some other end. On the contrary, it was the end to which everything else worth doing was a means. Aristotle argued that true leisure, by which he meant self-reflection and philosophical contemplation, was among the very highest of virtues because it was worth choosing for its own sake, whereas other virtues like courage in war or noble behaviour in government were virtuous only because they led to something else. The Latin word for business, negotium, translates literally as not leisure, reflecting the view that work was a deviation from the highest human calling. In this understanding of the situation, work might be an unavoidable necessity for certain people, above all for the slaves whose toil made possible the leisure of the citizens of Athens and Rome. But it was fundamentally undignified, and certainly not the main point of being alive. This same essential idea remained intact across centuries of subsequent historical upheaval, that leisure was life's centre of gravity, the default state to which work was a sometimes inevitable interruption. Even the onerous lives of medieval English peasants were suffused with leisure. They unfolded according to a calendar that was dominated by religious holidays and saints' days, along with multi-day village festivals known as ales, to mark momentous occasions such as marriages and deaths. Or less momentous ones, like the annual lambing, the season when ewes give birth, any excuse to get drunk. Some historians claim that the average country dweller in the 16th century would have worked for only about 150 days each year, and while those figures are disputed, nobody doubts that leisure lay near the heart of almost every life. Apart from anything else, while all that recreation might have been fun, it wasn't exactly optional. People faced strong social pressure not to work all the time. You observed religious holidays because the church required it, and in a close-knit village, it wouldn't have been easy to shirk the other festivities either. Another result was that a sense of leisureliness seeped into the crevices of the days people did spend at work. The labouring man, complained the Bishop of Durham, James Pilkington, sometime around 1570, will take his rest long in the morning. A good piece of the day is spent afore he comes at his work. Then he must have his breakfast, though he have not earned it, at his accustomed hour, else there is grudging and murmuring. At noon he must have his sleeping time, then his bever in the afternoon, which spendeth a great part of the day. But industrialization, catalyzed by the spread of the clock-time mentality, swept all that away. Factories and mills required the coordinated labour of hundreds of people, paid by the hour, and the result was that leisure became sharply delineated from work. Implicitly, workers were offered a deal. You could do whatever you liked with your time off, so long as it didn't damage, and preferably enhanced, your usefulness on the job. So there was a profit motive at play when the upper classes expressed horror at the lower classes' enthusiasm for drinking gin. Coming to work with a hangover, because you'd spent your leisure time getting wasted, was a violation of the deal. In one narrow sense, this new situation left working people freer than before, since their leisure was more truly their own than when church and community had dictated almost everything they did with it. But at the same time, a new hierarchy had been established. Work now demanded to be seen as the real point of existence. Leisure was merely an opportunity for recovery and replenishment for the purposes of further work. The problem was that for the average mill or factory worker, industrial work wasn't sufficiently meaningful to be the point of existence. You did it for the money, not for its intrinsic satisfactions. So now the whole of life, work and leisure time alike, was to be valued for the sake of something else in the future, rather than for itself. Ironically, the union leaders and labour reformers who campaigned for more time off, eventually securing the 8-hour workday and the 2-day weekend, helped entrench this instrumental attitude toward leisure, according to which it could be justified only on the grounds of something other than pure enjoyment. They argued that workers would use any additional free time they might be given to improve themselves through education and cultural pursuits, that they'd use it, in other words, for more than just relaxing. But there is something heartbreaking about the 19th century Massachusetts textile workers who told one survey researcher what they actually longed to do with more free time: to look around to see what is going on. They yearned for true leisure, not a different kind of productivity. They wanted what the maverick Marxist Paul Lafargue would later call, in the title of his best-known pamphlet, the right to be lazy. We've inherited from all this a deeply bizarre idea of what it means to spend your time off well, and conversely, what counts as wasting it. In this view of time, anything that doesn't create some form of value for the future is by definition mere idleness. Rest is permissible, but only for the purposes of recuperation for work, or perhaps for some other form of self-improvement. It becomes difficult to enjoy a moment of rest for itself alone, without regard for any potential future benefits, because rest that has no instrumental value feels wasteful. The truth, then, is that spending at least some of your leisure time wastefully, focused solely on the pleasure of the experience, is the only way not to waste it, to be truly at leisure, rather than covertly engaged in future-focused self-improvement. In order to most fully inhabit the only life you ever get, you have to refrain from using every spare hour for personal growth. From this perspective, idleness isn't merely forgivable, it's practically an obligation. If the satisfaction of an old man drinking a glass of wine counts for nothing, wrote Simone de Beauvoir, then production and wealth are only hollow myths. They have meaning only if they are capable of being retrieved in individual and living joy. Pathological productivity. And yet, here we'll need to confront a rarely acknowledged truth about rest, which is that we're not merely the victims of an economic system that denies us any opportunity for it. Increasingly, we're also the kind of people who don't actually want to rest, who find it seriously unpleasant to pause in our efforts to get things done, and who get antsy when we feel as though we're not being sufficiently productive. An extreme example is the case of the novelist Danielle Steele, who in a 2019 interview with Glamour magazine revealed the secret of how she'd managed to write 179 books by the time she turned 72, releasing them at the rate of almost 7 per year, by working almost literally all the time, in 20-hour days, with a handful of 24-hour writing periods per month, a single week's holiday each year, and practically no sleep. "I don't get to bed until I'm so tired I could sleep on the floor," she was quoted as saying. "If I have 4 hours, it's a really good night for me." Steele drew widespread praise for her badass work habits, but it's surely not unreasonable to perceive in this sort of daily routine the evidence of a serious problem, of a deep-rooted inability to refrain from using time productively. In fact, Steele herself seems to concede that she uses productivity as a way to avoid confronting difficult emotions. Her personal ordeals have included the loss of an adult son to a drug overdose and no fewer than 5 divorces, and work, she told the magazine, is where I take refuge. Even when bad things have happened in my personal life, it's a constant. It's something solid I can escape into. If it seems uncharitable to accuse Steele of being pathologically unable to relax, I ought to clarify that the malady is widespread. I've suffered from it as acutely as anyone, and unlike Steele, I can't claim to have brought joy to millions of readers of romantic fiction as a happy side effect. Social psychologists call this inability to rest idleness aversion, which makes it sound like just another minor behavioral foible. But in his famous theory of the Protestant work ethic, the German sociologist Max Weber argued that it was one of the core ingredients of the modern soul. It first emerged, according to Weber's account, among Calvinist Christians in Northern Europe, who believed in the doctrine of predestination, that every human, since before they were born, had been pre-selected to be a member of the elect and therefore entitled to spend eternity in heaven with God after death, or else as one of the damned, and thus guaranteed to spend it in hell. Early capitalism got much of its energy, Weber argued, from Calvinist merchants and tradesmen who felt that relentless hard work was one of the best ways to prove, to others, but also to themselves, that they belonged to the former category rather than the latter. Their commitment to frugal living supplied the other half of Weber's theory of capitalism. When people spend their days generating vast amounts of wealth through hard work, but also feel obliged not to fritter it away on luxuries, the inevitable result is large accumulations of capital. It must have been a uniquely anguished way to live. There was no chance that all that hard work could improve the probability that one would be saved. After all, the whole point of the doctrine of predestination was that nothing could influence one's fate. On the other hand, wouldn't someone who already was saved naturally demonstrate a tendency toward virtuous striving and thriftiness? On this fraught understanding, idleness became an especially anxiety-inducing experience to be avoided at all costs. Not merely a vice that might lead to damnation if you overindulged in it, as many Christians had long maintained, but one that might be evidence of the horrifying truth that you already were damned. We flatter ourselves that we've outgrown such superstitions today, and yet there remains, in our discomfort with anything that feels too much like wasting time, a yearning for something not all that dissimilar from eternal salvation. As long as you're filling every hour of the day with some form of striving, you get to carry on believing that all this striving is leading you somewhere, to an imagined future state of perfection, a heavenly realm in which everything runs smoothly, your limited time causes you no pain, and you're free of the guilty sense that there's more you need to be doing in order to justify your existence. Perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised when the activities with which we fill our leisure hours increasingly come to resemble not merely work, but sometimes, as in the case of a SoulCycle class or a CrossFit workout, actual physical punishment. The self-flagellation of guilty sinners, anxious to expunge the stain of laziness before it's too late. To rest for the sake of rest, to enjoy a lazy hour for its own sake, entails first accepting the fact that this is it, that your days aren't progressing toward a future state of perfectly invulnerable happiness, and that to approach them with such an assumption is systematically to drain our 4,000 weeks of their value. We are the sum of all the moments of our lives, writes Thomas Wolfe. All that is ours is in them. We cannot escape it or conceal it. If we're going to show up for, and thus find some enjoyment in, our brief time on the planet, we had better show up for it now. Rules for rest. Given all the blame I've been heaping on religion here for the modern Westerner's inability to relax, it might seem perverse to suggest that we should look to religion for the antidote as well. But it was members of religious communities who first understood a crucial fact about rest, which is that it isn't simply what occurs by default whenever you take a break from work. You need ways to make it likely that rest will actually happen. Friends of mine live in an apartment building on the historically Jewish Lower East Side of New York that's equipped with a Shabbat elevator. Step inside it between Friday evening and Saturday night, and you'll find yourself stopping at every floor, even if nobody wants to get on or off there, because it's been programmed to spare Jewish residents and visitors from having to violate the rule against operating electrical switches on the Sabbath. In fact, the actual prohibition, laid down in ancient Jewish law, is against lighting fires, but modern authorities interpret that to include completing electrical circuits. The other 38 categories of banned activities have been interpreted as outlawing everything from inflating water wings at the swimming pool to tearing sheets of toilet paper from a roll. Such rules strike many of the rest of us as absurd. But if they are, it's an absurdity well tailored to an equally absurd reality about humans, which is that we need this sort of pressure in order to get ourselves to rest. As the writer Judith Shulevitz explains, most people mistakenly believe that all you have to do to stop working is not work. The inventors of the Sabbath understood that it was a much more complicated undertaking. You cannot downshift casually and easily, the way you might slip into bed at the end of a long day. As the Cat in the Hat says, it is fun to have fun, but you have to know how. This is why the Puritan and Jewish Sabbaths were so exactingly intentional, requiring extensive advance preparation, at the very least a scrubbed house, a full larder, and a bath. The rules did not exist to torture the faithful. They were meant to communicate the insight that interrupting the ceaseless round of striving requires a surprisingly strenuous act of will, one that has to be bolstered by habit as well as social sanction. The idea of a communal weekly day off seems thoroughly old-fashioned today, persisting mainly in the memories of those older than about 40, who can still remember when most stores were open only 6 days per week, and in certain strange vestigial laws, like the one in my city prohibiting the purchase of liquor before noon on Sundays. As a result, we're in danger of forgetting what a radical notion the Sabbath always was. Radical not least because, as the former slaves who inaugurated it were at pains to point out, it applied to everyone, without exception. Shulevitz notes that in the Torah verses setting out the rules for the Jewish Sabbath, the fact that even slaves must be allowed to rest gets mentioned twice, as if it were an alien idea, which the text author knew would need to be forcefully driven home. And since the dawn of capitalism, it's been radical in a second way. While capitalism gets its energy from the permanent anxiety of striving for more, the Sabbath embodies the thought that whatever work you've completed by the time that Friday or Saturday night rolls around might be enough, that there might be no sense, for now, in trying to get any more done. In his book, Sabbath as Resistance, The Christian theologian Walter Burkeman describes the Sabbath as an invitation to spend 1 day per week in the awareness and practice of the claim that we are situated on the receiving end of the gifts of God. One need not be a religious believer to feel some of the deep relief in that idea of being on the receiving end, in the possibility that today, at least, there might be nothing more you need to do in order to justify your existence. All the same, it's surely never been harder to make the requisite psychological shift than it is today. To pause in your work for long enough to enter the coherent, harmonious, somehow thicker experience of time that comes with being on the receiving end of life. The feeling of stepping off the clock into deep time rather than ceaselessly struggling to master it. Societal pressures used to make it relatively easy to take time off. You couldn't go shopping when the shops weren't open, even if you wanted to, or work when the office was locked. Besides, you'd be much less likely to skip church or Sunday lunch with the extended family if you knew your absence would raise eyebrows. Now, though, the pressures all push us in the other direction. The shops are open all day, every day, and all night online. And thanks to digital technology, it's all too easy to keep on working at home. Personal or household rules, such as the increasingly popular idea of a self-imposed digital Sabbath, can fill the vacuum to some extent. But they lack the social reinforcement that comes when everyone else is following the rule too, so they're inevitably harder to abide by. And because they're reliant on willpower, they're prone to all the hazards involved in trying to force yourself to be more present in the moment, as explored in the previous chapter. The other important thing we can do as individuals in order to enter the experience of genuine rest is simply to stop expecting it to feel good, at least in the first instance. Nothing is more alien to the present age than idleness, writes the philosopher John Gray. He adds, how can there be play in a time when nothing has meaning unless it leads to something else? In such an era, it's virtually guaranteed that truly stopping to rest, as opposed to training for a 10K or heading off on a meditation retreat with the goal of attaining spiritual enlightenment, is initially going to provoke some serious feelings of discomfort rather than of delight. That discomfort isn't a sign that you shouldn't be doing it, though. It's a sign that you definitely should. Hiking as an end in itself. It's just after 7:30 on a rainy morning in midsummer when I park my car beside the road, zip up my waterproof jacket, and set off by foot into the high moors of the northern Yorkshire Dales. There's a splendour to this terrain that's most powerful when you're alone and in no danger of being distracted from the barren drama of it all by pleasant conversation, so I'm happy to be solo as I head uphill, past a waterfall with a satisfyingly satanic name, Hell Gill Force, and into open country, where the crunch of my walking boots sends startled grouse airborne from their hiding places in the heather. A mile or so farther on, far from any road, I stumble on a tiny disused stone church with an unlocked door. The silence inside feels settled, as if it hasn't been disturbed in years, though in fact there were probably hikers here as recently as yesterday evening. 20 minutes later, and I'm on the moortop, facing into the wind, savouring the bleakness I've always loved. I know there are people who'd prefer to be relaxing on a Caribbean beach instead of getting drenched while trudging through gorse bushes under a glowering sky, but I'm not going to pretend I understand them. Of course, this is just a country walk, perhaps the most mundane of leisure activities, and yet as a way of spending one's time, it does have one or two features worth noting. For one thing, unlike almost everything else I do with my life, it's not relevant to ask whether I'm any good at it. All I'm doing is walking, a skill at which I haven't appreciably improved since around the age of 4. Moreover, a country walk doesn't have a purpose in the sense of an outcome you're trying to achieve or somewhere you're trying to get. Even a walk to the supermarket has a goal, getting to the supermarket, whereas on a hike, you either follow a loop or reach a given point before turning back, so the most efficient way to reach the end point would be never to leave in the first place. There are positive side effects like becoming more physically fit, but that's not generally why people go on hikes. Taking a walk in the countryside, like listening to a favourite song or meeting friends for an evening of conversation, is thus a good example of what the philosopher Kieran Setia calls an atelic activity, meaning that its value isn't derived from its telos, or ultimate aim. You shouldn't be aiming to get a walk done. Nor are you likely to reach a point in life when you've accomplished all the walking you were aiming to do. You can stop doing these things, and you eventually will, but you cannot complete them, Setia explains. They have no outcome whose achievement exhausts them and therefore brings them to an end. And so the only reason to do them is for themselves alone. There is no more to going for a walk than what you are doing right now. As Setia recalls in his book Midlife, he was heading toward the age of 40 when he first began to feel a creeping sense of emptiness, which he would later come to understand as the result of living a project-driven life, crammed not with atelic activities but with telic ones, the primary purpose of which was to have them done and to have achieved certain outcomes. He published papers in philosophy journals in order to speed his path to academic tenure. He sought tenure in order to achieve a solid professional reputation and financial security. He taught students in order to achieve those goals and also in order to help them attain degrees and launch their own careers. In other words, he was suffering from the very problem we've been exploring. When your relationship with time is almost entirely instrumental, the present moment starts to lose its meaning. And it makes sense that this feeling might strike in the form of a midlife crisis, because midlife is when many of us first become consciously aware that mortality is approaching, and mortality makes it impossible to ignore the absurdity of living solely for the future. Where's the logic in constantly postponing fulfillment until some later point in time when, soon enough, you won't have any later left? The most unsparingly pessimistic of philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer, seems to have seen the emptiness of this sort of life as an unavoidable result of how human desire functions. We spend our days pursuing various accomplishments that we desire to achieve, and yet for any given accomplishment, attaining tenure at your university, say, it's always the case either that you haven't achieved it yet, so you're dissatisfied because you don't yet have what you desire, or that you've already attained it, so you're dissatisfied because you no longer have it as something to strive toward. As Schopenhauer puts it in his masterwork, The World as Will and Idea, it's therefore inherently painful for humans to have objects of willing, things you want to do or to have in life, because not yet having had them is bad, but getting them is arguably even worse. If, on the other hand, the human animal lacks objects of willing because it is at once deprived of them again by too easy a satisfaction, a fearful emptiness and boredom comes over it. In other words, its being and its existence become an intolerable burden for it. Hence it swings like a pendulum to and fro between pain and boredom. But the notion of the atelic activity suggests there's an alternative that Schopenhauer might have overlooked, one that hints at a partial solution to the problem of an overly instrumentalized life. We might seek to incorporate into our daily lives more things we do for their own sake alone, to spend some of our time, that is, on activities in which the only thing we're trying to get from them is the doing itself. Rod Stewart, radical. There's a less fancy term that covers many of the activities Setia refers to as atelic. They're hobbies. His reluctance to use that word is understandable, since it's come to signify something slightly pathetic. Many of us tend to feel that the person who's deeply involved in their hobby of, say, painting miniature fantasy figurines or tending to their collection of rare cacti is guilty of not participating in real life as energetically as they otherwise might. Yet it's surely no coincidence that hobbies have acquired this embarrassing reputation in an era so committed to using time instrumentally. In an age of instrumentalization, the hobbyist is a subversive. He insists that some things are worth doing for themselves alone, despite offering no payoffs in terms of productivity or profit. The derision we heap upon the avid stamp collector or train spotter might really be a kind of defense mechanism, to spare us from confronting the possibility that they're truly happy in a way that the rest of us, pursuing our telic lives, ceaselessly in search of future fulfillment, are not. This also helps explain why it's far less embarrassing, indeed positively fashionable, to have a side hustle, a hobby-like activity explicitly pursued with profit in mind. And so, in order to be a source of true fulfillment, a good hobby probably should feel a little embarrassing. That's a sign you're doing it for its own sake, rather than for some socially sanctioned outcome. My respect for the rock star Rod Stewart increased a few years back when I learned, from newspaper coverage of an interview he'd given to Railway Modeler magazine, that he'd spent the last 2 decades at work on a vast and intricate model railway layout of a 1940s American city, a fantasy amalgam of New York and Chicago, complete with skyscrapers, vintage automobiles, and grimy sidewalks, with the grime hand-painted by Sir Rod himself. He brought the layout on tour with him, requesting an additional hotel room to accommodate it. Compare Stuart's hobby with, say, the kite-surfing antics of the entrepreneur Richard Branson. No doubt, Branson sincerely finds kitesurfing enjoyable, but it's difficult not to interpret his choice of recreational activity as a calculated effort to enhance his brand as a daredevil, whereas Stuart's model train hobby is so at odds with his image as the leather-trousered, gravel-voiced singer of Do You Think I'm Sexy that it's impossible to avoid the conclusion he must genuinely do it out of love. There's a second sense in which hobbies pose a challenge to our reigning culture of productivity and performance. It's fine, and perhaps preferable, to be mediocre at them. Stuart confessed to Railway Modeler that he isn't actually all that good at building model train layouts. He paid someone else to do the fiddly electrical wiring. But that might be part of why he enjoys it so much. To pursue an activity in which you have no hope of becoming exceptional is to put aside for a while the anxious need to use time well, which in Stuart's case presumably involves the need to keep on pleasing audiences, selling out stadiums, showing the world he's still got it. My other favourite pastime besides hiking, banging out the songs of Elton John on my electric piano, is so uplifting and absorbing, at least in part precisely because there's zero danger of my chimpanzee-level musicianship ever being rewarded with money or critical acclaim. By contrast, writing is a far more stressful undertaking, one in which it's harder to remain completely absorbed because I can't eradicate the hope that I might accomplish it brilliantly, meeting with high praise or great commercial success, or at least do it well enough to shore up my sense of self-worth. The publisher and editor Karen Rinaldi feels about surfing the same way that I do about cheesy piano rock, only more so. She dedicates every spare moment she can to it, and even wiped out her savings on a plot of land in Costa Rica for better access to the ocean. Yet she readily admits that she remains an appalling surfer to this day. It took her 5 years of attempting to catch a wave before she first managed to do so. But in the process of trying to attain a few moments of bliss, Rinaldi explains, I experienced something else. Patience and humility, definitely, but also freedom. Freedom to pursue the futile, and the freedom to suck without caring is revelatory. Results aren't everything. Indeed, they'd better not be, because results always come later, and later is always too late.